My own son, a police officer, handcuffed me on my front lawn. His wife slapped me so hard my ears rang, then screamed that I'd lost my mind. They said I was unstable, that I needed help, that I was a danger to myself. The neighbors stood frozen, unsure whether to believe what they saw or what they were told. But I knew the truth. I had paid for that house, brick by brick, year by year. And that night, with rain soaking through my blouse and steel biting into my wrists, I realized there was something far worse than betrayal. Silence. They thought I was powerless, but they didn't know. I helped write the very system they tried to use against me. I had started avoiding the upstairs altogether. I knew exactly which floorboards creaked near the hallway. I knew how long the microwave beeped before Janelle would snap and say I was doing it on purpose. And I knew, without a doubt, that the woman who once called me Mom now wished I would disappear. The house felt like it belonged to someone else now. The same house I bought 32 years ago, with the payout from working late shifts at the emergency response office and clipping coupons just to afford heating. My name wasn't on the new title, not anymore. I had asked Troy to add his name when I was going through a rough patch with my health 5 years back. It was meant to be temporary. He never added mine back. The irony, I still paid for the taxes, still paid for most of the repairs. I even gave them the money for the new roof last spring. But Janelle didn't want me near the attic when they had the workers over, said I made people uncomfortable. Most nights I stayed in my room downstairs. I had a little fridge, a hot plate, and a small recliner. Troy used to bring my dinner plate down. These days, they just left it outside the door like I was some nursing home patient. They had started calling it their home out loud. That stung more than I expected. One afternoon, Janelle barged into my room without knocking. She said they needed the space for her new home office and that it made more sense if I stayed in the sunroom or looked into one of those senior facilities that had a nice community. Troy stood behind her, silent, arms crossed. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That silence hurt worse than anything she said. I asked if I had done something wrong. She didn't even respond, just said, "It's not personal, Beverly. It's just time." But it was personal, deeply. That night, as I sat alone listening to their laughter upstairs, I pulled out the old photo of Troy when he got his badge. He was smiling, standing next to me on the steps of the academy. I had been so proud, so naive. I keep thinking, when did my son stop seeing me as his mother and start seeing me as a burden? They didn't scream. They didn't slam doors. That would have been easier. They chipped away at my presence like it was unwanted dust on a shelf, soft, consistent erasure. And still, part of me wanted to believe Troy didn't mean it, that maybe he was caught in the middle, didn't know how to stand up to her. But something in his eyes that day, empty, resolved, told me he had chosen his side. If you've ever sat in a house you built, surrounded by family you raised, and still felt invisible, then you understand. You understand what it means to lose your place in your own home, and worse, to realize you're not even missed. It started with a quiet breakfast and a stack of papers on the kitchen table. Janelle sat there already, dressed sharp, hair pinned back, tapping a pen against the countertop. Her coffee was barely touched. When I walked in, she didn't look up. Troy stood near the fridge, arms folded. He didn't say good morning. He just pointed to the chair across from her like it was a deposition, not a family kitchen. I sat down. My coffee was already poured. I noticed that strangely, almost like they expected me to come in. Janelle slid a folder across the table. Inside were a set of documents, neatly arranged, with yellow tabs marking where I was supposed to sign. She didn't give a long explanation, just said this would make things simpler. more secure. That if anything happened to me, Troy and she wouldn't have to go through a bunch of legal mess to access the house. She used the word streamlining. I kept my hands folded. I asked who drafted the documents. She said a friend of hers. Real estate law, she added. Good reputation. She used that tone again. Professional, efficient, thinly veiled control. Then Troy spoke, said it was just a formality, that we were still a family, that they loved me. The words didn't match his posture. I looked at the first page. It said I was transferring full ownership of the house to Troy and Janelle as a joint gift, with immediate effect. No clauses, no protections, no rights to remain. I asked what if I didn't sign. Janelle's lips curved in that smile she used when talking to realtors. She said I could stay here as long as I wanted. But things were getting more complicated with taxes, insurance, liability. That word again, liability. Troy didn't say a word. I told them I needed time. Janelle's smile froze for a second, then softened. She said, of course. Take a day or two. But things were moving, and we'd all feel better with this settled. I carried the folder to my room like it weighed 50 pounds, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it. I wasn't surprised. I had seen it coming. I just didn't know it would feel like this, like being quietly evicted with a pen instead of a notice. The rest of that day was silent. No one brought me dinner. I didn't eat. The papers stayed on my nightstand untouched. The next morning, Troy knocked. That was unusual. He used to just walk in. He asked if I'd had a chance to read everything. I said yes. He asked if I was ready to sign. I said no. His face didn't change. He just nodded and said, well, let him know. By that evening, the hallway light outside my room had been unscrewed. I heard the creak of attic stairs going up, the shuffle of boxes. Janelle's voice, muffled but firm, rearranging, reclaiming, like they were already preparing for me to be gone. That night, I didn't sleep. The house creaked like it was breathing heavy. I kept thinking how strange it was to be surrounded by your own furniture, your own curtains, your own framed photographs, and still feel like a guest, like your presence was tolerated, not welcomed. No one slammed doors, no one raised their voice, but the message was clear. They wanted me out. Not next year, not next month, soon. 3 days after they gave me the documents, I walked into the living room and found them standing by the mantel, whispering. Janelle held a measuring tape. Troy held his phone. They stopped talking when they saw me. She smiled, too quickly. She said they were thinking about redoing the walls, maybe repainting, updating the space a little. She gestured toward the far end of the room and mentioned the idea of converting the downstairs into a studio space. For her, of course. Something about natural light. I nodded. Then I walked past them and stood in front of the fireplace. There, on the shelf where I had always kept the photo of my late husband and our boys when they were young, I found the frame had been turned down, face first. Right beside it was a fresh photo of Janelle and Troy, arms around each other in front of a new listing sign. The photo had the company logo on it, Janelle's real estate firm. That same night, I opened the linen closet in the hallway to get a clean towel, and something caught my eye. Half my boxes were gone. The top shelf, where I stored old winter clothes and photo albums, was completely cleared. There were storage bins I didn't recognize, labeled with Janelle's handwriting, marketing supplies, office inventory. I didn't say anything. Not yet. The next morning, Janelle told me she had booked an appointment for me at a local senior housing community. She called it a tour. Said she already spoke to someone and they had a room available by the end of the month. It wasn't a suggestion. Her tone had shifted. I asked why she thought that was necessary. She said she was thinking of everyone's comfort, that the house had shifted, that her work required privacy, that the neighborhood wasn't suitable for someone my age living alone. I reminded her that I wasn't alone. This was my house. She corrected me. She said it used to be. Troy stepped in, hands on his hips, and said this wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about what made sense. They had plans. The house needed to evolve. I was part of the past. He didn't use that word exactly, but that's what he meant. A shadow of what used to matter. I felt my knees go soft under me, but I stood still. Later that day, I walked down the hallway toward the back room, where I had stored my old files in a locked cabinet. Things from when I worked in emergency policy and social services. Manuals, training guides, court notes. The cabinet was open. The folders were gone. I searched the closet, the bottom drawer, even the shoebox where I kept copies of my pension letters. Empty. That evening, they served dinner without a word. Baked chicken, broccoli, rice. Mine was on a paper plate, placed on a side table, with plastic utensils. I looked across the room and saw they were eating with ceramic plates, glass cups, wine. It was subtle, but deliberate. I knew by then that they weren't waiting for me to sign. They were preparing for the day I'd leave, whether I wanted to or not. And what broke me most was the quiet confidence in their actions, like they believed they could erase me without lifting their voices. Just small, methodical steps. Redefining the house, the space, the routine. Rewriting the story without me in it. It was a Sunday afternoon when things finally tipped. Janelle asked me to come upstairs. Her voice was even, too calm, like she'd rehearsed every word. When I got to the top of the stairs, I noticed my framed portraits were gone from the hallway. In their place were new canvas prints of beaches and real estate slogans. I paused. She noticed. She led me into what used to be the guest room. The door had been freshly painted. Inside, my sewing cabinet was gone. The twin bed had been replaced with a sleek glass desk, a ring light, a laptop, and a branded backdrop. She called it her new office. I asked where my things had gone. She said they'd been moved into the sunroom for now, just until I had finalized my next steps. Her words were smooth but final. Troy stood in the doorway, not saying anything. That same night, I heard movement again. Boxes being shifted. I stepped out quietly and walked toward the garage. The lights were on. Troy was stacking storage bins. Mine. Labeled with tape in Janelle's handwriting. Some marked donate. Others labeled attic. Some not labeled at all. He didn't stop when he saw me, just kept taping. His silence was like a wall. I asked him if this was really happening. He said it was best to just get ahead of things. No drama. He used that phrase. No drama. I went back to my room, closed the door, and sat for a long time. They were trying to make it look clean, like a transition, but it felt like a quiet eviction. No papers, no arguments, just erasure. The next morning they called a family meeting. They didn't ask if I was available. They told me to come to the dining room at 10. I sat at the head of the table, the same spot where I used to serve holiday meals, where Troy used to sit and swing his legs as a boy. Now he was a man in uniform, arms crossed, face closed. Janelle placed a thick envelope in front of me. Inside were two sets of documents. One was a revised deed, this time with updated signatures. The other was a care home brochure, folded neatly, with a sticky note that said, "Pre-approved, move-in ready." She said it was a safety precaution. that she had spoken to someone about elder vulnerability laws, that, technically, they could petition the court if I was seen as unstable. She said it softly, carefully, but it landed like a slap. I looked at Troy. He didn't flinch. I stood up. My knees were shaking, but I didn't let them see it. I walked out of the room and into the kitchen. My breath felt tight in my chest. I opened the back door and stepped outside. The air hit my face like cold truth. They weren't asking me to leave. They were preparing to make sure I couldn't come back. And that's when it shifted. Not in a loud way, not with shouting or a broken dish, but something in me clicked. I walked back to my room, opened the drawer under my bed, and reached for something I hadn't touched in years. It was a black box, slim and flat, tucked under old tax files. Inside was a small transmitter, one I hadn't used since my days working for the Department of Protective Services. It still worked. I pressed the test button. A tiny green light blinked. Then I closed the box, slid it into my purse, and zipped it shut. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had something they didn't know about. And that was enough for now. The transmitter hadn't seen daylight in nearly 2 decades. I kept it for emergencies back when I worked with the Department of Protective Services. It was meant to alert the internal investigations line when frontline agents were under threat or witnessing abuse from within the system. When I retired, they never asked for it back. Most people didn't even know those channels still existed. I didn't activate it yet. I just kept it close. The next few days passed in a haze of quiet calculation. I watched them more closely. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Subtle phone calls between Troy and someone he only referred to as Captain Reese. A folder left open on the kitchen counter labeled Transfer of Guardianship. A browser tab left on Janelle's laptop showing the county clerk's site. It wasn't just about the house anymore. They were building a legal case to remove my autonomy. They had planted a narrative somewhere that I wasn't mentally stable, that I needed care, that I might be a danger to myself. I found an envelope addressed to a local elder care attorney. The return address was Janelle's office, but I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I went into the garage one afternoon and pulled down the locked chest from the upper shelf. Inside were files I hadn't touched since the early days of drafting protocols for elder abuse response units. I had co-written half the compliance manuals still used by social workers today. I knew the process. I knew the loopholes. I knew how to document. I started gathering everything, every interaction, every conversation. I printed screenshots of my text exchanges with Troy from years ago, showing that I had originally added him to the deed for medical power of attorney, not ownership. I took photos of my medication bottles organized by date. I downloaded video from the baby monitor I had kept hidden in my downstairs room, which had captured Janelle, opening drawers and removing files. I documented everything. One night, I heard them in the kitchen. Janelle was laughing. She told Troy not to worry. Said by the time I realized what had happened, the paperwork would already be filed. That guardianship cases didn't need much proof if the story was emotional enough. I wrote that down, word for word. It was then I decided to activate the transmitter. Not a dramatic gesture, just a tap. 1 second. It would alert the state office with a timestamp and my old clearance code. Then I waited. The next morning, things moved quickly. Troy came down in uniform, but I noticed his badge wasn't clipped to his chest. He was carrying it in his hand. That was new. He said we had a guest arriving. Someone from the department. Said it was a wellness check. Routine, just paperwork. I nodded. 10 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up. Not a cruiser. Unmarked. Then another. Then 5 more. One after the other. quiet, precise. Captain Reese was the first to step out. He didn't smile. He asked for Troy by full name, not as a colleague, as a subject. Janelle appeared in the doorway, wearing a blazer like she had dressed for a negotiation. But when the second agent stepped inside and requested to see her licensing documents and her client intake forms from the past month, her face changed. I stepped back. Let them take the room. No yelling, no struggle, just the sound of pens clicking open and folders being unzipped. Troy didn't look at me, not once, and I didn't say a word, because I didn't need to. I woke up the next morning in the quietest house I'd heard in months. No footsteps above me, no blender whirring, no orders about parking in the driveway, just the soft hum of the heater and the birds tapping at the window. The SUVs were gone. So were the voices. The officers had stayed for nearly 3 hours the day before. They moved in pairs, polite but firm. One team focused on the guardianship papers Janelle had drafted. Another reviewed Troy's recent use of department databases. I hadn't known how deep it all went. I hadn't wanted to. It turned out Janelle had pulled my prescription history through a private insurance system using Troy's badge number. She had compiled a file suggesting I had early-stage cognitive decline, even though I had never missed a payment, a date, or a name in my life. They built an entire story on carefully selected half-truths, enough to frame me as a liability, just enough to justify a quiet signature from a judge. But now, that story was under review. By noon, I received a call from Internal Affairs. A woman named Rachel spoke slowly, clearly. She thanked me for using the legacy emergency transmitter, said it hadn't been activated in years. She told me they had matched my code to a dormant but verified clearance profile, said they'd be reopening an investigation that had been previously sealed. I knew what she meant. 5 years ago, I had filed a report against Captain Reese himself for mishandling elder protection protocols. He had retaliated by cutting funding to our department. I had kept records. I hadn't used them. But now, someone else had pulled them up. A full audit was underway. None of that changed the fact that I still lived in the same house with the same people. Troy came home late that night, alone. His steps were slow. He walked past my room without stopping. I heard the fridge open. The microwave beeped. Then silence. Janelle never came back. The next day, a notice arrived. A formal request for a meeting with the Office of Property Claims, listing me as the current disputed occupant and Troy and Janelle as the temporary transferees. That phrasing gave me pause. I called the number at the bottom of the page. The woman on the other end recognized my name. She said there had been a flag on the title transfer request. Something about inconsistencies with the signatures, mismatched dates. She said they would be freezing any changes until a full review was completed. I hung up and sat with that for a long time. The house was still mine. Not just legally, but physically. I had survived it. I had named it. Every wall, every brick, every repaired hinge held pieces of me. And I realized something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. Not joy, not victory. Just quiet, steady relief. But also grief, not because of the betrayal. That had already done its damage. But because I saw what Troy had become. The boy who once hid behind me during storms had learned to stand tall by erasing me. He didn't just let Janelle do it. He helped her. He chose her plan. He watched me shrink in my own home and never once reached out a hand. I no longer hoped he'd apologize. I no longer wished he'd explain. I simply knew I would never trust him again. That was the final loss, and I accepted it. The days that followed moved in slow, quiet waves. Troy barely spoke. He stayed upstairs most of the time, door shut, phone pressed to his ear. I could hear fragments through the floorboards, meetings with union reps, something about administrative leave, internal review. Each word confirmed what I already knew. His badge was no longer clipped to his chest because he wasn't allowed to wear it. Janelle didn't come back. She sent a courier to collect her things. 2 large boxes taped shut. One of them had my handwriting on the side. It had once held Christmas lights. Now it carried whatever she had claimed from the kitchen drawers. I didn't stop them. I just opened the front door and let the man take them. I spent the next afternoon in the sunroom. The air was cool and steady. For the first time in months, I opened the window. Let the wind move through the space. It stirred the curtains just enough to remind me the house still breathed. Then I went to the back closet and pulled out the last file I had hidden. It was the original property folder, signed and notarized 20 years ago. The deed had my name alone. The amendment from 5 years ago, which added Troy temporarily, had been marked with a stipulation that it would revert back to sole ownership upon resolution of my medical condition. That clause had never been triggered, because I had recovered within 6 months. But I never filed the paperwork to change it back. I had trusted him to do it. That was my mistake. I took the folder to a woman named Althea, a retired civil claims lawyer who had been a friend of my late husband. She lived alone now, taught law part-time, and still kept a license for pro bono work. She read the folder slowly, page by page. Then she looked at me. She said it was fixable. She said Troy's signature on the transfer attempt had been copied from an old insurance form. The notary listed hadn't held a valid license for over a year. The filing had gone through only because of a digital loophole that allowed preliminary documents to sit in the clerk's system without verification. In other words, the transfer was voidable and likely fraudulent. We filed an injunction. Within a week, I received formal confirmation. The county had issued a temporary freeze on all title changes to the property, pending full review. Troy would be served papers if he attempted any further transactions. When I came home that day, the hallway lights were off. The TV was silent. Troy sat at the table, shoulders slumped, eyes unfocused. He didn't ask where I had been. He didn't offer an apology. Instead, he said he'd be moving out by the end of the month. No anger, no fight, just that. I nodded. That night I made soup for myself, the kind I used to make when the boys were small. Potatoes, corn, leftover ham. I didn't offer him any. I sat at the table with one bowl, one spoon, one napkin. No place set for him. And for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't ache. It settled around me like a blanket. Familiar, steady, mine. The house was still standing, and so was I. It was late September when Troy packed the last of his things. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't ask for help. One day I heard the sound of cardboard dragging across the floor. The next, his room was bare. No footsteps upstairs, no keys jangling by the door, just stillness. I didn't watch him leave. I let him close that door without a goodbye. The driveway was empty by morning. What remained was a house that felt too quiet in the wrong places. Not peaceful, not yet. Just emptied, like a theatre after the curtain falls. You sit there, alone in the audience, and the air is still thick with what had just played out. I didn't try to fill it. I let the quiet stay. That week, I went through every drawer, every folder, every corner of the house. I wasn't looking for things to save. I was looking for what needed to be removed, what had been left behind. I found old emails Janelle had printed and tucked inside her work folders, proposals for turning the garage into a rental unit, budget spreadsheets titled Renovation Phase 1. None of them had my name on them. I fed every sheet through the shredder. I took out the trash myself. There were also things that didn't deserve to be erased. A photo of Troy when he was 10, smiling crookedly with a missing front tooth. A birthday card from years ago where he had scribbled the word hero in blue marker. I didn't throw them away. I didn't keep them on display either. I placed them in a sealed envelope and put it in the back of the cabinet. Some memories didn't need to be burned. They just needed to rest. After the house was cleared, I stood in the middle of the living room and asked myself what this space should become now that it was mine again. Not a showroom, not a shared battleground. Something softer, something real. I called a contractor and asked about taking down the partition wall that Janelle had added near the kitchen. She said it could be done in 2 days, so I scheduled it. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove out to the edge of town, to a small community centre where I used to volunteer before everything became complicated. It had been renovated, with new benches, clean walls, and a small garden in the back. I offered to run a class, not a lecture, not anything official, just a weekly circle for women over 60. A space to talk, write, share what life looks like after the losses no one talks about. Dignity, space, power. The director smiled and said yes. We set the start date for October. On the way home, I stopped by a bookstore. I picked up a notebook, not for legal notes, not for evidence, just blank pages. I wanted a space to write without being watched, without bracing myself. That night, I cooked for myself again. Same soup, a little thicker this time. I sat by the window, the cool wind touching my face. I lit a candle, not for morning, but to remind myself this house still had light. I no longer waited for footsteps down the hall. I no longer feared what might be taken. There was no victory banner hanging across the porch, no announcement made to the neighborhood. But in that silence, something had shifted. This house was mine, and this time I would protect it differently, not with anger, but with boundaries, with clarity, with the quiet power of someone who had been erased and decided to reappear on her own terms. The letter from the Ethics Review Board arrived on a Thursday morning. A plain white envelope, no seal, no drama, just a folded report and a short note. Troy's case had been formally reviewed. The findings concluded that his actions violated department protocol, breached ethical conduct regarding vulnerable family members, and failed to disclose conflicts of interest. They didn't use the word fired, but they didn't have to. It said administrative leave had been extended indefinitely, pending further disciplinary action. His badge was deactivated, his access to systems revoked, and a recommendation had been made that he not be reinstated in any future family-based intervention roles. I placed the paper on the kitchen table and just sat with it. I didn't feel joy. I didn't even feel closure. What I felt was distance, as if the version of Troy who once called me Mum no longer shared a face with the man who had tried to erase me. That same afternoon, I had a meeting with the notary board. Janelle's license had been suspended pending an investigation. Several forged verifications were traced back to her home office. When I arrived, the woman reviewing the case was already holding my file. She said it was one of the cleaner examples of systemic manipulation she'd seen. That word stuck with me. Systemic. It hadn't just been one cruel moment. It had been a structure, a process, thought out, papered over with politeness, smoothed by silence. That night, I sat in my new office, the sunroom, freshly repainted and cleared. No leftover boxes, no misplaced furniture, just a desk, a lamp, and that new notebook. I opened it to the first page. I wrote down 3 names: Troy, Janelle, my own. Not out of anger. I needed to see them together, side by side, without distortion. To remind myself this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about recognition, about seeing clearly the people in your life and choosing what roles they are allowed to keep. The next morning, I called the county clerk's office. I asked to speak with the registrar regarding property updates. I gave them the old deed number, then requested that the property title be legally amended, stripped of all temporary parties, and returned to sole ownership. The clerk on the line paused. Then she said the title had already been updated. It had happened quietly, filed by an assistant working under the Property Ethics Committee. As part of the investigation, all associated names were removed until legal counsel advised otherwise. In other words, it was mine again, officially. I asked for a hard copy. She said one would be mailed within a week. As I ended the call, I looked around the room and felt the weight shift. Not lifted, just moved. Relocated to a place I could carry it without breaking. Later that day, the garden crew arrived. I had scheduled them weeks ago, asked for a full reset. They tore out the old hedges, pulled the roots, cleared the soil. Then they planted dogwoods along the fence, soft lavender by the porch, and a small stone bench under the tree Troy once used to climb. I stood at the doorway and watched it unfold like a memory rewritten, not erased, just re-anchored. I didn't need the neighbors to understand why the changes were happening. I didn't owe anyone a version of the story that made it cleaner. What happened in this house had already shaped me. Now I was shaping it back. Not with revenge, with return, with roots, with the slow work of rebuilding something from what remained. This wasn't about taking back power. It was about choosing peace over permission. And this time, no one was asking me to leave. It was early October when I received an invitation from the City Council's advisory board. They had heard about the incident, not through headlines or gossip, but through a quiet recommendation from someone on the Protective Services team. Apparently, my documentation, the way I had navigated the system, had reached a few desks. They asked if I would consider joining a new task group on elder housing policy. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be part of anything again. But something inside me, something that hadn't stirred in years, said yes before my mouth could catch up. The first meeting was in a modest brick building downtown, the kind with low ceilings and burnt coffee in the lobby. I walked in and recognized no one. They were younger, sharper in appearance, some with tablets, others with color-coded files. But they listened when I spoke. They paused when I shared a page from my old compliance files. They took notes when I told them how easy it had been for my own son to file a guardianship claim without medical proof. They didn't look at me like a victim. They looked at me like a colleague. It had been years since I felt that. After the meeting, I sat in my car and let the silence wash over me. Not the silence of loss or retreat, but the silence that comes after being heard. At home, I opened the windows and let the cool wind sweep through the hallways. The scent of new paint had faded. The house smelled like cedar again. I stood in the doorway of the room Troy once used and noticed the light fell differently now. Brighter, unfiltered, no shadows collecting in the corners. I didn't close the door. I left it open. Later that week, I ran my first women's circle at the community centre. 7 of us sat in a half circle, each with a cup of tea and a notebook. No agenda, no introductions, just space. One woman spoke about her daughter moving her into a trailer behind her own house without asking. Another talked about signing over her pension account because her grandson promised he'd help manage things. No one interrupted. No one tried to fix it. We simply listened. When it was my turn, I didn't tell them everything. I just said this. I used to believe that family was the safest place to rest. Now I believe it has to be the safest place to resist. That evening, after I got home, I stood outside in the garden. The dogwoods had taken root quickly. Their leaves were already shifting colours. I ran my hand across the stone bench and thought about all the versions of myself this house had held. A young wife, a mother, a widow, a woman begging to be seen, and now a woman who had stopped begging. Not bitter, not closed, just clear. I made soup again, thicker now, with barley and leeks. I placed one bowl on the table. No second bowl, no second chair. I didn't look at the clock, didn't wait for footsteps. Instead, I sat with the stillness, and for the first time, it felt like a presence, not an absence. Like something had returned, not someone, but something. A sense of self that had once been swallowed whole and now sat quietly beside me. I didn't need anyone to knock on the door. I had already come home. It was a Thursday afternoon when the envelope arrived. No return address, just my name, written in Troy's familiar handwriting. The paper had been folded neatly, as if that could soften what was inside. I stood by the kitchen sink as I read it. Each line held the tone of someone trying to sound measured, maybe even regretful, but never quite reaching the mark. He said he had been attending sessions through the department's wellness program, that he now understood the weight of what he'd allowed to happen, that he didn't expect forgiveness, only hoped I was well. There was no apology, not for the paperwork he signed behind my back, not for the meetings I was never invited to, not for the look he gave me that night in the kitchen when I realized my name was disappearing from everything I had built. What he gave me wasn't sorrow, it was distance dressed up as closure. I folded the letter and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, not out of sentiment, but to remind myself that even silence can arrive wearing polite language. I didn't reply. That weekend, the lavender by the porch bloomed all at once. It caught me off guard. One morning the stems were bare, and by afternoon the air was thick with scent. The bees came in small waves, and I let them have the space. The house felt different in those days, not because it was cleaner or quieter, but because it no longer held anticipation. I no longer listened for footsteps, or paused at doors wondering who might walk through. Everything now had a place, even the ache. One of the women in the circle, Marlene, invited me to her birthday. Nothing grand, just cake, coffee, a handful of women who knew how to sit in a room without filling every silence. I brought lemon bars. She smiled when she saw me and said I had changed. I said I hadn't. I had just stopped waiting to be saved. On the way home, I passed by a bookstore and noticed a small sign in the window. A writing group for seniors was starting up in November. Weekly meetings, open mic nights. I paused, staring at the flyer longer than I needed to. I didn't take a photo, I didn't sign up. I just stood there long enough to know I could if I wanted. At home, I opened the notebook again. Page 37, I wrote about my front porch, about how it used to be a place I avoided when Troy and Janelle sat out there. Now, it was where I had tea each morning. I wrote about the silence in the evenings, how it no longer pressed in on me but wrapped itself around me like something earned. That night, I opened the front door, stepped outside, and sat alone. The street was quiet. A few porch lights glowed down the block. I could hear a child laughing faintly in the distance. I didn't feel old. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt like the keeper of something sacred, not the house, myself. And in that moment, I understood what had shifted. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had forgotten I had built this life before they ever tried to take it. And now, with or without their names in it, I would continue writing it, quietly, steadily, as mine. It was a cold morning when I walked past the mirror and saw myself clearly for the first time in a long while. Not the weariness, not the years. I saw the steadiness in my shoulders, the quiet in my eyes, the refusal to bend. The house smelled like rosemary and books. A faint trace of old lemon cleaner clung to the windowsill. The kind of scent that didn't demand attention, but reminded you something had been cared for. By now, the paperwork had long been settled. My name was the only one on the deed. The city records updated, the garden in full bloom. The women's circle at the centre had grown from 7 to 15, and they came not just to speak, but to listen, to build. Troy never wrote again. No phone call, no second letter. And I didn't wait for one. Some silences deserve to stay untouched. One Sunday afternoon, I stood on the back steps with a cup of tea and watched a bird build a nest in the awning above the shed. Straw, thread, bits of something blue. Piece by piece she carried her life in her beak and tucked it into the place she had chosen, not the safest place, but hers. And I thought, so had I. That week, I hosted the first gathering in my home. Nothing formal, just a few neighbours, women from the group, a pot of soup, slices of pear tart, and laughter that rose without permission. No one asked about the house, no one mentioned the past. But I noticed how easily people moved through the space, like it was whole, like I was whole. Later that night, I walked each room, ran my hand along the hall, turned off the lights one by one. When I reached the bedroom, I paused by the open window and let the air brush against my skin. Then I whispered something I hadn't said out loud in years. I am not waiting anymore. Not for approval. Not for repair. Not for anyone to undo what was done. This life, however scarred, however quiet, is mine. And that, finally, is enough. If you've ever had to rebuild your life quietly, piece by piece, after someone tried to erase you, I hope this story reminded you of your own strength. Sometimes, peace doesn't arrive with fanfare. It shows up in the silence you finally get to choose. If any part of this story resonated with you, know you're not alone. Thank you for listening, truly.